types.
So, in your outcrosses, did you feel like the litter as a whole had consistency to itself in phenotype, or you just feel that every dog within the litter stood on its own ground independently and had traits that you were happy about?
I've seen a little of both, to be honest. I had an outcross that I did an outcross after an outcross, and it was a different direction. And it was my Hercules Isabel breeding. Isabel breeding was Scully to Phoebe, that was scatterbred. Scully was scatterbred. So then, whenever I bred to another dog named Hercules from Laurent Sauchamp, it was really unique that the majority of the breeding, and this is what I would call my most hybrid breeding, because the dog was a little bit more European influence with that more European hybridy underbite. The majority of the litter were very consistent in head types. And I'd never produced, it was my first litter I produced. I'm going to call him a bully because he shows in the bully ring. But even my standards were very consistent across the whole litter, even though they were hybridy. That litter was consistent ish. My other ones were more, as you describe, very, very nice, but more stand on their own with some
Now,
differences in
was Laurent's
phenotype.
dog was that dog line bred or was it scatterbred?
I have to go back and look at them kind of loosely. It was a loose line bred. I don't think you would call him scatterbred, but he was kind of loosely line bred.
Okay. It was this what dog would this have been from?
Mighty Bull Hercules.
Uh, I felt like
So he was out of
okay.
Bevan,
Yeah, yeah. Yep,
bred
yep, yep, yep.
to.
Yep, I
You
did.
found him? You see it very loosely line bred.
Yeah, yeah, very loosely line bred. You're gonna have to go back a few generations to see that. So,
Yeah.
let me ask you this, and I'm gonna ask you this because I know you've just received a pup off of Baxter, and with
Yeah.
eh, I've always been a Baxter fan, and I've seen a lot of pictures of him, and he's a very impressive dog, on his own. But saying that Gesa, is not a big fan of line breeding, what I have noticed off of Baxter is maybe be a lack of consistency. Not saying that he's not producing nice dogs, but that maybe the type he doesn't technically always produce his type. Um, do you feel like that puts you at a disadvantage when you kinda decide to use something like that, that maybe you're not necessarily gonna get the dog that we all kind of, um, look at and all over and we're like, "Oh, I really want that type of dog." That's what I'm after is I want my own Baxter, right? So that's what I look at. I look at the dog and I'm like,
Mhm.
"Ooh, I want some of that." But then you start to follow for me, I'm very detail oriented, so I wanna follow the productions so I can see how the dog's producing. Um, and your pup, ironically, coincidentally, whatever, really does kind of seemingly fit his phenotype. But that's probably one of the few, and
Yeah.
not to say that I've seen all of his productions, but I've seen a couple people use him, and I've kind of followed along. Um, but your pup seems to carry that phenotype, and I notice it through the markings as well. That there's a high probability that he could turn out to be something very similar to that. But do you feel like it's a disadvantage because they haven't in some fashion put more than one shot of that dog into their program?
No, I've actually got another shot of Baxter in my program because
Mhm,
I have Fireball. Fireball's out of Hercules. Hercules is out of Bevan. Bevan is out of
mhm.
Baxter. So it is in mine. I've got another shot in my program elsewhere, but he's still young to be determined if it's gonna how he's gonna be utilized. I This pup is a standard hybrid pedigree. Because if you look at the mom actually has a little bit of a bully influence. And so I'm looking for a Baxter. I've been in love with Baxter ever since I got into the breed. I've been in love with Giza's dogs. So, and I said her name differently than you do. I don't know. She hasn't corrected me yet. So I've been in love with Baxter. I love Micmac. You know, I love the look. A lot of those standard hybrid type dogs. I love the look of them. I love the muscle. And I'm hoping that with the consistency that what I saw when Blue was used in her program, that litter was consistent. And so I'm hoping that there's still going to be a certain amount. I'm crossing my fingers. But what I do want is the muscle. I want the cheeks. There might be some differences and there might be some differences in type, but what I hope to get out of him and what I saw in the puppies, because keep in mind, I flew there and I did see some of the puppies. There was one bully in the litter, and the rest were a standard or a standard hybrid. There's a strong possibility that when they mature out, there's going to be some consistencies, but there just might be some small consistencies that in the long run will just separate them all out. But influencing into my program, I think it's similar enough that I should still have something close to my program. Hopefully, I'm not
So
sure. We'll see. I'll tell you the nicest female that he should be bred to right now is Katie. I really wish Katie was 2 years younger or he was 2 years older to try to mash those two together, because that to me is my
so
ideal.
your intention is to line breed all Baxter. So I guess that's but see that's
Kind of. I just don't know
I
how
get that, but
yet.
I guess that's my point is like, is it and I'm trying to highlight the differences in mentality between her and you. Now, you see what
Yeah.
I'm saying?
Okay. I
So
see.
she's not comfortable
Yeah.
potentially crunching down consistently and in numerous maybe she's done it. And I don't follow her program enough to know, so I don't want to speak for her.
Yeah.
But she, from what I'm gathering, doesn't have a tendency to line breed on a dog or not do it for a long period of time. But you've got a couple shots of this a few generations back, and now you're potentially going to have one up close, assuming that the dog turns out by your standard, and your immediate intention in your mind is, "I got a line breed on this thing." And, and
Um, yes, I my version of line breeding is probably a little bit different from other people's description or of line breeding, and maybe mine's different from others. So maybe that might be where we might not
okay,
be
well,
talking the same
let's
thing,
do
so
that.
to
Let's
speak,
talk
too.
about it. So what does how do you define line breeding versus inbreeding? Where do you draw the line at where it goes from line breeding to inbreeding?
I would have said line inbreeding is a half sister, half brother, which I've done once. A mother son to me is inbreeding. Line breeding, I did an aunt to a nephew, and maybe that's inbreeding. To me, line breeding is when it's in there a few different times in the 5 generations, at least in generation two, and again
Mhm.
between at 3 or 4. But it might be a lot looser and a lot like my description of a line breeding might not be what the next person thinks it is. And there's a lot of people out there crunching in like really tight, and I'm just not super comfortable with that.
Yeah. So I agree. I think a 3-2 or beyond, a 4-2, a 3-2, that's line breeding to me. And I think when you get into mother, son, father, daughter, half siblings, I think that's when you truly call it inbreeding. Um, and I know that's a contentious point for a lot of people to understand that, but in the
Yes, it
context of our
is.
conversation, it still has value because we're trying to understand, you know, where you're going potentially with what you're doing, and then inversely what she has done and felt comfortable with. Um, and I think it's fair to say that if you don't line breed, that there is a higher probability of mixed results versus trying
Yep.
to at least
Yep.
hone in a couple generations. Whether where you go from there is up for debate. I know that I've seen people do half siblings, produce a dog off of that, and then take that pup to essentially another half sibling that was outcrossed and bring basically three generations in the second generation back together. You know, I haven't quite gone that deep yet, but like I said before, if you go back to those pedigrees in the early 2000s, I mean, you could see a dog like Mufasa. It almost looks like it's ridiculous how many times he's shot into a pedigree at times. Um, and I don't have any knowledge of really what the results of something at that level were, but now I can attest that most of the dogs that I see online and promoted are very loosely bred, and really, for somebody like myself, have little to no value, because they would have to have a lot of litters on the ground for me to feel comfortable using something like that
Yep.
that doesn't have some type of line breeding in their background. Um, while we're on this subject, um, one thing I've noticed within your program was that Blue, who isn't line bred at all, correct? Yeah, so Blue,
No, a little bit of
yeah,
Boyd's, like
yep,
a
yep,
bunch of
yep,
Boyd's back there,
yes.
but
W
distantly.
What's interesting about him is that he seems to produce himself pretty well, or his,
Yeah.
yeah, or his type, which
Consistently.
is a unique thing. I mean, it really is a unique thing to have a dog that's scatterbred, and we can do all the testing we want, but what we don't really understand is the concentration of genes. He might be in a situation where he's 80% one way and 20% the other, sire to dam or dam to sire, however you want to look at it. And then honestly, just kind of be a unicorn for himself to be able to consistently produce. Now that you know that he produces like that, um, as a breeder, how how does that change your game plan as far as how much you want to use him if a goal of your program is to be consistent?
I've used in the beginning, I didn't even use him in my own program till he was 4 because I didn't have the right dog to use him on. The very first dog that I used him on in my program was his half sister. What was really interesting is that Sadie is Scully to Phoebe, Blue is Moose to Phoebe. Phoebe is small. Phoebe outproduced herself all day long. When I bred those two half siblings together, I got a monster. Dio is huge, and he's got phenomenal hip scores. He's got beautiful type. The other three that were in the litter, there was four. The other three had some similarities, but the litter was inconsistent looking. They were nice. Interestingly enough, I had one that went to a pet home and I got him back, and he's now a camp dog. He's a champion. He's like a smaller version of Dio, but he looks a lot similar. He's just smaller, really nice type. The other brother is completely different. And then the female, she ended up being a liver nose. She went to a hog hunting home. She caught hundreds of hogs, really nice type. Um, she was kept differently. Um, but the litter itself, all four of them, they weren't
Do you think
consistent. But what was consistent was specific traits were consistent. Teeth. He produces massive full mouths of teeth, and in all the litters he produces
Do
that.
you think that in that half brother, half
Out
sister breeding, if you went back and just focused in on Phoebe's pedigree, do you feel that that that's where the inconsistency within the litter came from because you basically inbred on her and not males, correct?
Yeah. Yes. You got the 3 males in the litter all look a little bit like something
Mhm.
from what's behind her. They pulled some stuff. Now, don't get me wrong, there were still some things being pulled because keep in mind, Scully and Blue were also both preachermen grandsons, so that comes through too, and that's where that leg starts coming through. But when I breed Blue within my program, I get consistent, moderate sized dogs. But in Europe, when they used him in 2 different breedings, their litters were so consistent, like so consistent, and not a lot of color. And when Laurent used him, same thing, a consistent litter of mostly white dogs with big teeth and standard muzzles. So when people really say hybrid, I got hybrid because behind my dogs there's, some dogs that were bully, but Blue consistently throws long muzzled standard dogs with huge teeth. And with the exception of one breeding in Europe, moderate sized dogs and extremely
So
athletic.
let's so what is this what are his stats so everyone that's listening can understand when you say Blue stats, he's roughly how tall to the withers and where does he typically carry his weight?
He's only 23 and a half to 24 at the withers and
Okay, and
84
so when you
pounds.
say moderately produces
Mhm.
moderate sized dogs, you're saying probably an 80-pound male and a 60 to 70-pound female?
You're probably getting a high 60s female to and a
Yeah.
mid
And
80s male
yeah,
for the
and that's
most
kind of
part.
where
Yeah.
my sweet spot is. I've had numerous people call me over the years asking for some ungodly 120-pound male, and it's just not for me, it's just not realistic. I think there's a lot to be lost at that weight. And my dogs that are consistently even in the even my males in maybe the high 70s to mid 80s, that's a lot of dog. I mean, if that dog really wants to get busy, that's enough dog to get it done. And I don't feel the need to take up extra space on the couch with 30, 40 more pounds. I just don't feel that it's warranted. And I think you really do sacrifice um athleticism when you start pushing that size. I don't know that I've seen anybody truly bring a dog up to that size that can really compete with an 80-pound male realistically. Um, well, that's interesting because I've always watched Blue. He kind of lives in that same generation as Prophet. um, he's probably consistently, I would say, from what I've seen, produced a little better than Prophet, consistent wise. Prophet's had some really nice dogs here and there. I think his full body of work is nice. I'd say one litter was surprising. It was a small litter and it was really bully, which was interesting. But it's always nice to see the dog that produces himself. I think that's something that somebody, if they were going to get into breeding or would entertain the idea of breeding, that's what you should be focusing on is finding dogs that are consistent in the way they produce. Because if they don't, they really don't have any value because at some point in your breeding career, it's going to become important that you produce a dog that's noticeable to your brand, your breeding program, um, because otherwise you're just kind of just building things that don't really. I mean, it's a new project every time. It doesn't have any consistency. So, and to go back to Dio.
Yeah.
Dio,
Yeah.
really caught my
Yeah.
eye. And I think the reason that was because of how similar he was to Blue, but in a bigger package. Um,
Yeah.
and knowing that he's a little more tightly bred, uh, to me has some interest. What I would do if that was my dog, I would probably breed him to a Blue daughter or granddaughter, because I think I would want to jump off the Phoebe genetics and concentrate it back to Blue, to try to lock that in for life, and at least have that tool for another 5 or 6 years. But that's your decision to make. And
Well, he does. I did an interesting comparison when I bred Blue to Fireball, and then I bred Dio
mm,
to
yeah,
Fireball,
that always has value.
and yeah, it's um, they're similar. They're really
Both
similar.
litters. Yeah.
They're huge, both litters, and they're both huge, and even bigger on the Dios. So far they're still young. They're only just under 4 months now. 4 months now. They're monsters. The litter has been a monsters. But there's a lot of substance coming through on Fireball in both sides. And this is an interesting concept when you combine Scully and Blue, and then you combine it again in the next generation. I think that's where that size is coming from, because Fireball is a granddaughter of Scully and then Dio. So these litters are, this is where I'm starting to get into some similarities, and then I'm going to do something very similar this year with Fireball's brother and Blue's daughter. So I'm going to see if I start to get similarities in like three-quarter related kind of breedings, and see how I get consistencies there as
Yeah,
well.
so that's kind of where I'm at as well. I've taken a couple different roads to produce dogs in different ways that have come out to be the same way in phenotype. And then right now,
Yeah.
I just, assuming that it takes, I did a breeding that, again, I took two different paths to build the same dog. And then now taking those exact phenotypes with shared pedigrees on both sides of the pedigree and bringing them back together. And hopefully, will create a female that we can move forward with, that will be not super crunch down, but pretty crunch down, and lock that phenotype in. Um, so yeah, that's always exciting. I do love the art of breeding. I think there, like you said before, I think it's value to note that it's a combination of art and science. Um, I would love to tell everybody that just because the dog is bred a certain way, it's going to produce a certain way, but it just never seems to be that way. And there are some dogs out there that seemingly, whether however they're bred, they seem to produce themselves. And should you be lucky enough to get something like that, you gotta use it and crunch it and make it work, because it can be lost if you don't pay attention to it. And if you got something that you love, you got to find a way to keep it, and that's not always easy to do. um so let's move forward. We talked about health testing. um And, eh, I think we kind of both are under the impression that we do the hips and elbows. We take it. You've been more fortunate than a lot of people. You've always gotten good scores. So that doesn't put your back up against the wall with what you want to do, especially if you spent some time campaigning a dog and you've titled it and maybe even worked it a lot and titled it there. But with the kind of evolution of testing, there was a time and a place where, you'd have to, if you wanted to test for this, you had to go to this particular place, and then you had to go
I
over
know.
here. And
Yes.
now it's kind of simplified a little bit with Embark. And I think you've touched on
Yeah.
that you did start using Embark. Um, what have you
Yes.
found with Embark that you like, you don't like? Have you found anything that's interesting? Because they're testing. Yes, there's a plethora of stuff that they're testing for that isn't really applicable to our breed, But there's some other information that
Yeah.
comes across, and I feel like every time I do a new embark, I get a little bit more every time, which is kind of weird. But what has your experience been with embark?
Well, I went from the gotta go all over the place, and I ended up at Paw Print Genetics for quite some time. And I switched when I started getting some liver popping up that I didn't see hitting. I didn't see coming. I for some reason, multiple generations later, suddenly I had some puppies popping up that were liver off of somewhere off the Phoebe line and then somewhere off the Scully line. It happened essentially when Katie was bred. When I brought him to Roman, we didn't see it coming. So then we knew that she was a carrier. So I had switched over to Embark at the time, so I knew which of my dogs were liver carriers. What I got from that was now that I'm doing a breeding that is going to be using a dog that has some other dilutes that I personally am not a fan of, the blacks and the blues, but to find a dog to match to Katie that was fully health tested, was a little bit more bully hybrid because I looking for a specific buyer, and was worked and show, we really started looking at Embark. And you can get a lot of things from Embark, from the dilutes and coat colors. And I mean, they test for curly coat, they test for long hair. Not that it's affected me, but when you really start looking at it, there's a lot of things in there to consider. The other thing I just love about Embark is it's all in one place. It I will say I had one experience where I had a litter and I wanted to send away a few, and the thing got lost in the mail. Sending stuff across the border sucks. Everything gets lost at customs, I swear, and then it's too late to make a decision to redo test them before puppies are back. But generally speaking, they're pretty good. And I like that you do one test and you can get all the health information and the color information. And I'm not having to resend back or add on another color coat test or something or get surprises later. So it's all in one shot. That to me speaks
Yeah,
volumes for
I
me.
I had an interesting, and I'm gonna keep this generic to protect the company, but I was using a company years ago for all my dogs, testing for NCL. And before I breed any male, I want to test everybody, just like most breeders do. And so I tested everybody. That this particular male that I was using, he was tested, he was clear, whatever. And I bred him 2 times, 3 times. 3 times I used him. And subsequently, I kinda got around to one of the females that I had kept off this dog. I was like, "Oh, I'm gonna start health testing her. I'm thinking about using her." And, she came back NCL carrier, and I was like, "How is this even possible?" So, and that was through Embark. So I had made the switch and I sent it off. And so I go back to this original testing lab and I'm like, look, like I know the female that I used was clear and you told me he was clear. What's going on? And so they went back and it took some time. And they went back and they said they sent me the wrong results. That now the way that yeah, which just kind of sucked, but unfortunately nothing ever was bred. Fortunately I didn't have an NCL female that I was doing like okay, I'm okay with doing this breeding because he's not a carrier. Thankfully that never happened because that would have been a bigger deal. But in the same respect. Now, what they did do was all the money that I'd ever spent with the company, they did refund me like almost immediately, and they did send me a warranted apology or whatever. But yeah, it really proves even more so that you need to be diligent with testing, offspring. You can't always take everything that you
Yeah.
get to be truth. Um, and then you have to manage around it. The reason I asked about Embark was because at one point, and you touched on this earlier, at one point, a lot of us were just testing for NCL or NCL and ick. And then now it seems like with Embark, there's a handful of other things that have come across. I think it's maybe the cardiac myopathy. I think there's HUU. I feel like there's one other one out there. Yeah, yeah.
NMR,
I don't know exactly what that is. Yeah.
something
Um,
like that. Yeah.
but with that, the HUU has become a new thing, and now I recognize that, oh, almost everything that I have off of sugar has HUU. So now I'm like, okay, another piece of the puzzle to
Yeah.
navigate around. Um, I don't, you touched on the liver nose, and clearly you have a preference for black nose. Um, would you wash out a dog solely on the pigment?
I select right from the time there's puppies. I did have one that I was considering getting something back out of complete outcross. That's Dio's belly sister. Unfortunately, she was
Oh,
killed by a rattlesnake with her whole litter of puppies. But other than that, I've generally made the selections right from the time they were puppies. If they were liver,
okay.
nope.
What
Um,
and just out of curiosity, because
yeah,
I've fought for a while to lose the liver, but I have produced a lot of nice liver dogs. So I as much as I want to
yeah.
get away from it, I find that I can't. Prophet unfortunately is a red recessive, so he throws the liver um, if bred with another recessive dog, and you know Prophet's really done well for me, and I've bred him to a lot of different types of dogs and gotten, a lot of dogs that I really enjoy in their phenotype and just their temperament. But what about the liver for you? Is it because of showing that you, or is it just a personal preference? Where does it come from?
I just try to stick to breed standards, and here's the thing, if I start letting all the little things slide, it starts to limit, and because I'm really glad I did. Blue's a liver carrier. I I'm very honest with that. He's a liver carrier. Katie's a liver carrier. Um, my other young female now, Legacy, she's a liver carrier. I've got them. So when I'm making the selections, I have to select appropriately. But it's it's show ring. But what's really made me think is that way back when somebody bought semen off of Blue and Scully, some breeders in Europe, they never would have taken the chance on them if they were liver. And so now I've got other breeders in Europe. They're coming to me for something new for their program. They wouldn't be taking a chance on a liver dog. So if I limit my breed, if I start handcuffing myself and I've got a carrier for this and I've got a carrier for this and I've got liver for this, and I start adding too many things into my program, I start to handcuff myself in what I am able to do. And because I don't discredit other people for it, but at the same time, I've used dogs that are carriers. I mean, obviously, I use Katie was bred to a carrier. I got a liver dog out, a couple livers out of it, but I pet home those liver ones, and then I just really try hard to work with the black nose ones and pray I end up with a non-carrier. And I did once. My Katie blue breeding, I got 14 puppies, so help me God, I never want to go through that again in my life. Um, and I got some livers in there, and the female I chose is not a liver carrier, thankfully, Maple. So I got lucky there, but in my other breeding to a liver carrier, my female ended up being the carrier, and the one I sent to Germany is not a liver carrier. So it's just me trying to reduce those little barriers that you might have when you're trying to make a breeding
Yeah.
decision.
So are you doing any testing of your litters before you're letting them go to try to hone your selection, or are you just
I tried that once and the test
yeah.
got lost. So we had to make a decision, and then we resent them away, and the test results showed up way too late. Like, I don't even know what happened, but it happens. But I haven't gotten to that point where I have to decide yet. It could very well happen in my next breeding for the people that are interested in buying pups off me. So if it came down to two, we might very well send off a test for a few of them right off the hop.
Yeah,
So
I struggle with it myself because I remember in my first litter, I produced a one liver male who ended up being a really exceptional dog. I mean, he really could have set somebody off well in a breeding program, and his liver was actually pretty dark. So I don't want to use the term chocolate, but it definitely was a darker of the version. Now I've produced some that are a lot more washed out, almost Dudley. Um, and as much as I want to get away from it, man, sometimes I look at the dog, I'm like, I don't know, man. I just the dog's too nice for me to get away from. Um, I fought for it for a while, but you make a good point, regardless of if we're talking about pigment, but it is a tough position to start jockeying around all of these. If you got five and you include, if we got five breed variants that we're concerned about, and then you take into account color. Now you're six, and you've got a lot to. I mean, there's a
yeah,
lot of jockey in there, and you said a lot of the dogs that you have now are carriers. So now you're almost double down. You got to be. It's just like anything. You've got to be even more picky and more
yeah,
selective if you want to try to avoid it.
yeah.
And
I have a few liver carriers, and then I have two HUU carriers from
mm,
using two outside studs. So now, and I don't regret my decision, but at the same time, I don't want to put myself even tighter. I probably, to answer your question, am going to start testing litters in the future when I know that could be a factor, to so that I don't keep one and go, crap, I've got another one that's a carrier of either of the HUU or the liver, and I'm just it is what it is. You're right. It's hard to remove a really good dog from a program
yeah,
because of
I've
it.
I've had we've I've had NCL for quite a few years now, so I have to at times test litters, and I've had mixed results. I did a breeding um where we had six males, and it was just six pups, six all males. Tested the entire litter. Of course, out of the six males, only one was an NCL carrier, and guess who wanted to keep that puppy? This guy. So I really just shot myself in the foot with it, but whatever. But I've had to test a couple full
I
litters moving out. Um, and then I have made some, just typically I'll take a 1 2 3 approach with kind of my dogs if I'm in a position where I have to eliminate uh or I'm concerned about a variant. And then once I get the results back, if 1 2 and 3 are all carriers, I'm just picking the nicest dog that I want to move forward with. And then if two of the three aren't carriers, then that may sway my position a little bit. But unfortunately, I did an inbreeding. It was a half brother to half sister breeding. Out of the six, only one was a freaking carrier, and I decided to keep him and move forward with him. And I don't regret that by any means. Just based on his phenotype, it fit the breeding, it fit the reason I did it, and I love that dog. And then I've had other breedings that I've done with an NCL carrier to where almost every dog in the litter was a carrier, and there was really no way to get around it. So, and for most of my people, it was all pet homes anyway, so it really didn't matter. Um, but yeah, with that being said, something came to my head when you have you ever used color genetics in picking your pup? So let's say, for example, when I say color genetics, you did the blue breeding, which produced Dio. Dio has the same colors, similar markings. Did that influence your decision at all? Have you ever seen a trend within your dogs that lead to a certain marking, or a combination between the marking and the color that leads you to say this dog takes after this part of this pedigree?
So interesting you say that because a lot of people probably think I picked Dio because he looked like Blue. He actually lives in a co-own home, has from the beginning. And a lot of people are starting to see a trend with the other side, with the double brindle eye patch or double brindle mask, I guess. A lot of, and then I come back with Baxter puppy who's got red mark on his face. You know, it, honestly, it was very much as much a decision evaluating the actual type and the temperament, and it coincidentally ended up with the same one with the markings.